Welcome everyone to the second and final class of Mishnah in-depth Horayot with Rabbi Joshua Kulp. Thank you everyone for coming for this brief session. Sources for today's class are the same as for last week. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Kulp.
All right, thank you, Kayla. Very happy to see everybody back here again. I am going to share the screen. Just want to get my screen organized over here. So let me just remind briefly, not everybody was there last week, but I'm not going to go over all of last week. Horayot is largely an interpretation and a sort of like figuring out how Vayikra Perek Daled and Bamidbar Perek Tetvav work. The main focus of Masechet Horayot, we're going to see a couple other Mishnah that focus on a little bit of something else. The main focus, I'll just go back to, is on this verse in Daled Yud Gimel, V'im kol adat Yisrael yishgu. V'ne'elam davar me'inei hakal. We're even to see these words. If all of the congregation or the group of Israel commit an unintentional error, v'ne'elam davar, something disappears from them, right? They basically don't know something from the eyes of the community. Notice, by the way, two different words in here. We might have a little play on that. Adat and kahal, right? We're going to get a little bit of that in the in one of the mishnayot. It seems, in the simple sense of the verse, that those are the same people, but we'll see some wordplay on that as well. And for the most part, the rabbis interpret this as a court issues a mistaken ruling. Right? How does it asking the question? How does it come to be that all of the people of Israel sin? Right? It can't be that just by coincidence all of the people of Israel share in the same sin. It must be that the court issued them a ruling, and that creates a situation where they bring a collective korban, a collective sacrifice. Here in Vayikra, they bring a par, a bullock. And in Bamidbar, which the rabbis interpret as referring to Avodah Zarah, they bring a slightly different sacrifice. We're not going to go too much into the difference between Vayikra and Bamidbar today. We went over that a little bit last week. But the important thing is that the Masechet is largely concerned with distinguishing between when is the court liable for the korban and when is the individual liable. That's in verse Kaf Zayin, V'im nefesh achat techata bishkaga. If an individual, and we saw a little bit at the beginning of this last week, we need to figure out, for the most part, either the court is going to bring or an individual is going to bring. There are occasions where there is a sin committed, a chet committed, and no one brings. But that's going to involve a situation in which somebody intentionally sins, right? All of these subjects are all unintentional sins, and they also have to deal a little bit with, right, what does it mean to unintentionally sin? When is somebody liable for something they did without intention, or when do they have to bring a korban, a sacrifice to receive kapara, atonement for their sin, and when are they either not afforded that opportunity, right, when they're intentional, or they don't even have to bring. They were so removed from any awareness that you wouldn't even accord it a mistake. We talked about that a little bit last time as well. I thought that was very interesting, right? A mistake to the rabbis implies at some point somebody had knowledge. Somebody who never has any knowledge is not even committing an accidental mistake. They're just completely unable to be in that world of culpability. To be culpable means that you have a little bit of guilt for forgetting that whatever you're doing is prohibited. Okay. I don't know if there were questions or I saw there were comments, but are those just...
No, that was me just reminding people about the source sheets. But if people have questions, please speak out.
Anyone have any questions about last week's stuff? Or anything in general? No. Okay. It's fairly straightforward. As usually happens, the the Mishnah gets more concerned with some of the nuances, the slight differences in situations, the exceptional cases, the borderline cases are what really interests them. So let's start. We're starting with Mishnah Daled from Aleph.
I go back for 1 second?
Yeah.
I mean, does it deal with distinctions? Like, what does it mean to do something unintentionally? Like, I don't know if kashrut is an example, but let's say I eat something that has pig in it.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that pig was prohibited. Okay, that's one thing. Or I didn't know that there was pig in what I was eating. Or I used to know that pig was prohibited, but I forgot.
Okay, so all of those could be covered by a chatat, by a sin offering. The particular, right, in Kritot, for instance, in the 3rd chapter of Kritot, it talks a little bit about that. It's particularly the case of not knowing that what you're eating. It doesn't use pig, it uses the difference between chelev, forbidden fat, and shuman, which is permitted fat, right? They would look alike, right? You know that chelev is prohibited and shuman is permitted, but you don't know which piece of fat is which, and you eat both of them, or you eat the wrong one, right? Or you're not sure which one you eat, right? So that would be a mistake in just not knowing the identity of something. For instance, in the 7th chapter of Shabbat, we have cases of people not knowing that the day is Shabbat. They know that you're not supposed to work on Shabbat, but they lost track of the days. They don't know what Shabbat is. But we also have there in Shabbat, which we talked about now, they forgot that, right? Not so much forgetting that there's anything such as Shabbat, but I forgot that, let's say, writing is prohibited on Shabbat, or I forgot that planting or harvesting is whatever, any one of the Lametet Malachot, the 39 Malachot, right? But we learned last week, according to Munbaz, which becomes, I think, the dominant opinion in rabbinic literature, you had to have once known and forgot, right? If you were converted among the Gentiles and you never knew that something was prohibited on Shabbat, then you're not liable for it, right? Shogeg implies that you once knew and you never know, and you don't know now. Now, by the very nature, though, in Horayot are, for the most part, not concerned with individual sins, but concerned with when the court gives a bad ruling. So there, we'll see a little bit more of this today. The individual is just, for the most part, just following the court. Now, we'll get some cases where the individual knows that the court gave a wrong ruling, but it's not, our Masechet doesn't address the issue of, like, you know that you can't eat chelev, but you just didn't know, or you know you can't eat pork, but you didn't know that what you're eating is pork and not beef or something like that. That's just because that can't be the result of a mistaken ruling, right? You could bring a chatat for that, but the court, that doesn't fit into our Masechet. Does that, you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, our Masechet is dealing with mistakes in halacha and not mistakes in reality, right? There's no, right, unless the court were to say Shabbat is to be observed on Wednesday or something like that, right? But that probably doesn't fit into the Masechet all that well. Okay.
Maybe can I ask you one question? I was fascinated by I think it's Asham Ola V'Yored, or is it Chatas?
Korban Ola V'Yored, yeah.
Right. Is that only for an asham? Because that struck me as such a interesting concept, that it's a sliding scale, and that only for one type of korban, or is that for many types of korbanot?
It's definitely there in Vayikra Hay, right? Vayikra Hay is
because I remember it from Chumash that sometimes, if a person couldn't bring this, then they brought the bottom level was a mincha, or they brought 2 birds, but is that always the concept of an Ola V'Yored? I mean, I wasn't familiar with that term.
Yeah. It appears in Vayikra Hay for the particular asham that's there in Vayikra Hay. I'm trying to remember if it appears anywhere else.
But the concept is not given for other. In other words, I understand.
It doesn't appear in Vayikra Daled for the chatat in Vayikra Daled. So
Oh,
it's not
okay.
there for the chatat, right? But there is.
But in other words, a shlumim was a shlumim, and if you couldn't afford it, then you couldn't afford it.
Well, I think you can bring a shamim from different kinds of animals, right? So, like, you can bring korbanot from different animals, but I don't think
Categories.
for like the difference between voluntary offerings, right, and mandatory offerings. That I don't remember exactly. I remember I don't think that there is any other example of three. In Vayikra Hey, there's three. You get large animal, small animal, and green. Right?
Right.
Excuse me, large a small animal, bird, and green. Right? So you have three there. But I don't think I'm just looking here and trying to remember. I don't think it appears anywhere else. I think it's only here. The rabbis call it a korban olev yored, right? And up and down because it depends on your wealth. I can see if I can look it up later on to try to remember.
Because I
But
thought that was an interesting concept of a
it is a
sliding scale.
fascinating concept, right? And we're going to talk about it later when it gets to the Nasi. Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. I'm just trying to remember. I feel like there's a two-part system with another korban. Give me 1 second. It might appear in Mitzora. Yeah, here it is. I knew it was somewhere else. The Mitzora this is in Vayikra Yud Daled Kaf Aleph, right? If he doesn't have enough money, the person who has a skin affliction, and he has to atone for the skin affliction at the end of his period of affliction, he can either bring, if he's wealthy, he brings a goat, and if he's not wealthy, he brings a bird and a grain offering, right? So you have it over there. I don't think you have the three-part system. But you have a two-part system over there, and it might be also for one of the Nida types impurity, the blood impurities as well. Yeah, here it is again. Yeah. I knew it was from a different part. In Vayikra Yud Bet. Thank you for being patient. In Vayikra Yud Bet, towards the end of the parak, for a woman in childbirth. After childbirth, she has to bring korbanot. And if she doesn't have enough money for a sheep, she can bring birds. So you don't have the full three-part system. Obviously, birds are much, much cheaper than a sheep. So you do have that allowance for mandatory offerings, especially for things that like people can't help, right? Obviously, a woman is going to give birth if she's able to do so. People getting skin afflictions, right? The shot of the Torah is it just happens, right? There's nothing they could do about it. So how can you mandate somebody to bring such an expensive offering? A sheep is a massive, very, very expensive offering. How can you mandate somebody to bring something that they can't afford, right? Whereas if you're bringing a voluntary offering, well, from the outset, just bring a voluntary offering that's a cheap offering. Bring a voluntary bird offering. You can bring whatever voluntary offerings you want. So that makes it more mandatory. I don't know if off the top of my head there's a place where like it would seem to be lacking, right? Why, right? The cases in Vayikra, hey, we'd have to look at those more intensely to see like some of them are people that like actually were at fault, right? Hatat, sin, asham, right? These are things that people did like they were actually at fault, right? Again, some of these don't work. They don't work always thoroughly because sometimes people bring sin offerings and it's hard to figure out what they did wrong. All right, it was a great question. And I also think it's very interesting. And a lot, what Deborah, what you say over here is also important to realize that a lot of this Mishnah in particular is attached to Parshanut of the Midrash on the Torah. Right? That's why I tried to bring in, right? Some prakim of Mishnah have very little relationship with the Torah. There's just not that many psukim. There's a lot of psukim in this Masechet. And there's a lot of trying to figure out when are we in Vayikra Daled, when are we in Vayikra Hey, do the rules of Vayikra Daled apply to the rules in Vayikra Hey? And so there's quite a bit of that coming up too. Okay, let's learn a couple mishnayot together. Horu Beit Din v'yada echad mehen shetal. So the Beit Din rules, and they know that somebody made a mistake. One of them knows that they made a mistake. V'amar lehem toim atem, and he says, you're mistaken. O shelo haya mufla shel Beit Din sham. The mufla is a word used in the Torah, ki palemim chadavar, when something escapes you. Pele in modern Hebrew is like wondrous, right? But here it seems to be ki palemim chadavar, means something escapes you. You don't know the answer to something, and then you go to the Beit Din Hagadol. The position of mufla shel Beit Din only appears in Horayot and in texts that are related to Horayot. Scholars really don't know what this is, right? The Talmud has interpretations. I think probably the best interpretation is it's like a particularly knowledgeable person on the court, right? The Bavli will tend to interpret these guys as Rosh Yeshiva, right? But we're talking about in the Second Temple where they didn't have like a yeshiva as was known in later times in history, and trying to reconstruct what the court would have been like in the Second Temple period from the Mishnah is historically a difficult endeavor, but he only appears in this context. Other cases with post-Second Temple courts, we get things like Av Beit Din, Nasi, right, which do seem to be positions that existed in the rabbinic period. Mufla shel Beit Din does not exist anymore. It's like a Second Temple position, and not a position that occurs anymore in rabbinic times. Okay, I don't have much more. Like, I tried to like read a whole bunch of literature on who this guy is. No one really knows who he is. O shaya achad mehem ger o mamzer o natin. Okay, excluded from, according to the rabbis, lineage counted in your ability to participate in the Beit Din Hagadol. Somebody whose lineage was not fully Israelite, a ger, a convert, or was a problematic lineage of a mamzer. A mamzer is a child either born of a mamzer or born of an illicit union, and a natin is supposedly a descendant of temple slaves from the time of Joshua, but it's also used as like a lowly a genealogical lineage. Those people are not supposed to participate on the Beit Din. It's interesting, though, what you kind of in between here is that they could be on the Beit Din, but they're not supposed to be on the Beit Din. I mean, the Mishnah is a double-edged a little bit here, right? If they're not supposed to be on the Beit Din, then how come they're issuing this ruling, right? How is it that we have a Beit Din that has a mamzer on it if the Beit Din's rulings aren't fully accepted if there's a mamzer on it? Again, I don't know how much historical information you can get from here, but at least in ideology, the rabbis, at least for the Second Temple period, they imagine that lineage matters towards a person's ability to serve on the court. All right. O zaken shelo ra'a lo banim. Right. Another very interesting supposition that in order to serve on the court, you had to have children. Right. Admittedly discriminatory, I fully realize not everybody is able to have children. Right? It is saddening. It is, let's say, I don't want to live in a world in which we discriminate against people who don't have children or don't allow them to have positions. That's not part of my zeitgeist anymore. But I think you can understand it. And also, look, as a father, I do remember thinking how much my world had changed once I had my first child, right? Again, I don't want to say you can't be kind without children. I don't think that's true. I know many kind people who don't have children, but as soon as I had a kid, I looked at that kid and I just looked at every other kid I knew in the world and realized that kid is somebody's child. And just the same way I have infinite love for my child, everybody else in the world usually has infinite love for their children. And it created a little bit more mercy in me. I think that's the rabbinic ideology over here, that somebody who knows the precariousness of having children is more fit to be a judge of others than somebody who doesn't. But again, I don't want to overdo it, because I've been teaching for many years and I've taught many people who have not been able to have children, and it's not a particularly welcome thing to to tell a person like that they can't be kind is beyond my ability. I don't think that's true. All right. In any case, all of those people are like they don't constitute a real court, right? They're not ru'in horayot. They're not supposed to be issuing rulings. And so if the court issues a ruling, harei elu pturin, right? That court is exempt because it's not a real court. And that would mean that the individual who sinned is culpable, is obligated. Now, again, here, you can see here, like the person is listening to a court, right? If I'm an individual and a court, for instance, has a mamzer on it or a ger on it, issues a ruling, I probably still think that the court's ruling is correct. The court told me I can do X, Y, or Z. I did X, Y, or Z, but I still have to bring a korban, a sacrifice, because the court's ruling wasn't done by a real court. There needs to be somebody to bring a sacrifice to expiate for this sin. And since the court can't bring it, because the court wasn't real, the individual is left, let's say, paying the bill in this case. And this comes from a midrash, shenemar kan eda in Vayikra Daled, v'nemar lahalan eda. That is in the case of issuing, deciding whether somebody is a murderer. Ma ha'edah amor lahalan ad shiyu kulan ru'in horayah. That eda over there in Bamidbar Lamed Hey has to be fit for instruction. So too ha'edah amor kan ad shiyu kulan ru'in horayah. So too, the one over here has to be fit for instruction. Okay. Horu, let's go on a little bit more with this. Mishnah, Horu beit din shogigin va'asu kol hakahal shogigin. Mivi'in par. That's our base. I think I put this in case 1. The court made a mistake. People mistakenly followed, so the court brings a sacrifice. The Mishnah, in the next few Mishnah, sort of like goes over the main rules of the Masechet. That's the classic case. Court mistakenly made a rule, people followed the rule, the court brings the sacrifice. In the second case, mizidin va'asu shogigin, if the court intentionally ruled in error, and then the people followed, right, they can't bring, the court can't bring a sacrifice. You never bring a sacrifice for an intentional sin. That's like a principal rule in korbanot. Korbanot are for unintentional sins and not for intentional sins. So if the court intentionally offers a mistaken ruling, the court can't bring. Now that the court can't bring, the individuals have to bring.
What does that sentence mean? They intentionally ruled in error.
The court intentionally said something that was wrong, right? And not in error. They ruled wrongly. Mizidim, they ruled wrongly.
Okay, so, but what does it mean they intentionally ruled wrongly?
It means
as opposed to mistakenly ruled wrongly.
Yeah, so mistakenly ruled wrongly, means that they forgot something. They didn't know that it was prohibited to do X, Y, or Z, right? We had those cases, right? They didn't know that, let me just go back to that Mishnah, right, from the...
right, what we did in the past.
Last week,
right.
Yeah, we did last week, right?
Right.
They didn't know that you can't carry from one domain to the other. That was the case in the Mishnah, right? So they didn't know that. Now, I think what you're asking is like, how would this work into a real life? Like, who would tell them later on? That's like,
I don't understand how you can intentionally do by mistake.
No, not by mistake. You intentionally rule wrongly, right? They know that you're not allowed to carry. And for whatever reason, I don't think this is realistic, but they intentionally tell people you're allowed to carry from one domain to another when they know that you're not allowed to carry from one domain to another.
That sounds like Navi Sheker stuff.
Well, that's the rabbis interpret that as more of like nevuah, but or making up new rules. But yeah, I don't think this is I don't think like it's hard to imagine a court of 71 people actually doing this. More, I would read this as like the Mishnah reminding us that if there's any element of mazid, of intention, there's no sacrifice. So, I don't know if like,
perhaps to highlight the difference between ruling, making a mistake and not making a mistake.
Yeah.
Between last week's and this week's example. just
Yeah,
to highlight the stark.
highlight that you can't bring a sacrifice for intention. Intentional errors can't bring a sacrifice. By the way, it would probably include even if one person knew that they were making a mistake, and right, we've sort of said that already.
It did, we said that,
Yeah,
right?
if one person knows they're making a mistake and they still make that rule, right? They're, if he still rules intentionally, you simply can't bring a sacrifice for an intentional error. Okay, and then they get the third case, shogigin. This is where there's no sacrifice brought, but the court ruled unintentionally, right? Meaning they made a mistake. The court, again, in the court normal case, forgot what the law is or didn't understand the law properly, made a mistake in ruling, but the people knew. The person knew that the court had ruled wrongly and acts that way and acts in accordance anyway, right? The person knows, for instance, carrying is prohibited and does it anyway. Even though the court told him to, he knows he shouldn't do it and he does it anyway. There's no korban brought over here. Everybody is patur, is exempt because the court can't bring for the person's intentional sin, and the person can't bring for an intentional sin because you never bring a sacrifice for an intentional sin. It kind of falls in right. If the court ruled accidentally, so in theory, as soon as a person doesn't act based on the court, the court should bring, because the court ruled here. But here, since the act was actually done b'mezid, there's no korban. There's no sacrifice. I think that's like a very important concept in the laws of sins and sacrifices, is that sacrifices are not for unintentional sins.
Is there any earthly punishment?
Excuse me. Sacrifices are not for intentional sins. Yeah. Say it again, Ira.
Is there any earthly punishment for intentional sins?
Yeah, well, it would depend on what the sin is, right? Right. If it's a sin that has, I'll answer two things. First of all, if there's mita, if there's a death penalty involved, such as Shabbat, then in theory, at least, the person would be obligated for the death penalty. Whether they were actually able to carry it out is a different story. But in theory, for some of these things, certain forms of incest, and certain other, and Shabbat, Avodah Zarah, are all punished by the death penalty. In theory, right? Again, it doesn't matter if they didn't actually do it because of witnessing and et cetera, et cetera. For the rabbis, karet gets malkot, right? That's in the third chapter of Makot. So for the rabbis, karet is this biblical penalty that, like, it's hard to know. The rabbis don't think it's actually karet can't be carried out by the court. It's not a penalty. It might have been originally in some early era expulsion from the community, to cut somebody off from the community. But rabbis don't read it that way. They don't do that anymore for karet. So they develop this idea that if you get lashes, you get out of karet. So the rabbis' karet is a otherworldly punishment, right? Sometimes considered premature death, but natural death, not one carried out by the court, or punishment in the world to come. To avoid that punishment, you have in the third chapter people getting malkot, which according to rabbinical lashes, according to rabbinic theology, gets people out of the biblical punishment. So there might be for Mezi. Right? Again, all of this, I think you should keep it in mind. Rabbis aren't really doing this. There are no real stories of rabbis acting this way. For the most part, they're projecting this back into the Second Temple, and they just don't do this anymore for whatever reasons, right? We're not authoritative enough. We don't live in such a world. There's probably practical, historical reasons, theological reasons, interpretive reasons. I'm not saying, I don't want to say rabbis never had courts that punish people for things, but the biblical style punishments are not really being carried out. Certainly, all the stories of rabbis or sages executing people in the Talmud are never done according to halacha. They're all done not according to halacha, meaning they really should.
I mean, this isn't the discussion of bringing sacrifices is all entirely theoretical at this point, right?
Yeah, by the Mishnah, it's theoretical. Of course, they don't know what time there may become practical again. That's, there's always a possibility things become practical again. But that doesn't really, in terms of what interests the rabbis and what they talk about, interpretation of the Torah is extremely important. They spend tremendous amount of energy interpreting portions of the Torah that sometimes they don't even think ever happened. There's I'm trying to remember, there's 18 chapters of Nagaim, right? You'll get there eventually. Nagaim, right, skin afflictions, is a huge Masechet, right? It is larger than like Ketubot, which is another big Masechet, right? It is a large Masechet that, maybe it's 13 tied with Ketubot, that according to places in rabbinic literature, it never happened, right? Not just doesn't happen in their day, but never happened. But there's a lot of Parsha, there's a lot of Torah about Nagaim. There's like 3 whole chapters. So rabbis are very interested in parts of the Torah, even if they're not reality for them anymore, right? I think that, as you learn Kodashim and Torahot, you're going to see that that's abundantly obvious. All right.
Also Ben Sorera Moreh.
Ben Sorera Moreh, yeah, that's just like one chapter, but like there's just huge portions of Mishnah that are, I think if you look in the Mishnah, probably about half of the Mishnah, more than a third, is dealing either with Kodashim, right, sacrifices for the most part, or Torah, the purity laws. Some of the purity laws are still being observed in the rabbinic period. A lot of them aren't, right? But they spend think about how much time Jews spend a day studying Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava, most of those are not halacha lamase anymore. It's my favorite stuff, Thank you. Okay. Thanks. So I thought it was like a little bit of an interesting sugya over here. Just a little note of like, especially the mipnei ma amru horu b'davar she'stukim modim bo pturim, right? Why are they exempt if they issue a ruling that's so obvious that even the Sadducees know that it's usher? Right? They should have learned. The court should have learned. Basically, the court, maybe Deborah, this comes a little bit to like something you were saying before. They're intentional. If they rule something that's so obviously against halacha, then this is a court that should have learned, right? They're almost like mazit, right? They're almost intentional because they're so, at a certain point, a person can be so negligible in their ignorance of the law that you can't count it as an unintentional sin anymore. You have to count it as intentional sin, right? A court that issues such a blatantly wrong ruling is really an intentionally errant court, because you shouldn't be issuing a ruling if you didn't even bother learning anything. Okay, I thought that was a little bit interesting over here. All right, I think because of time, there is a lot in the next Mishnah about the variations of the communities, of how many people are doing a sin, and the tribes. But Larry, I will note here that like Rabbi Yehuda talks about the tribes. There are no tribes anymore by the rabbinic period. People have lost, right? Even in the middle of the biblical period, right? You can go all the way back to like the 8th century. There are no longer 12 tribes of Israel by the time you get to Sancherib. But Rabbi Yehuda is here issuing legislation for a situation of tribes and 12 of them, right? Which means that like this is clearly purely parshanut, right? But it's interpretation of the Torah, which is, I can't emphasize this enough. You guys, I know some of you, you're advanced students, right? You've been learning for a while, right? The Mishnah is not simply a halacha lamase book, right? The Shulchan Aruch, when it was put out, was a halacha lamase book. The Mishnah, I always tell the kids, it's not an interpretation of the Torah either, but sometimes it is. Right? In these passages here, right, Bava Batra is largely not an interpretation of the Torah. Ketubot, large parts of Ketubot are not interpretations. Kedushin, there's like lots of Masechtot, are very small amounts of Torah in there and very practical. Right? This Masechet is very impractical, very much related to a reality that doesn't exist anymore and didn't even exist from time immemorial, right? There's no one in the rabbinic period who remembers the 12 tribes, not even close, right? Maybe there's people in the rabbinic period who remember their great-grandfather's grandfather was alive during the Second Temple period. But 12 tribes, right? There are no tribe. The tribal identity seems to have been lost much, much earlier. And yet they're still talking about it quite a bit. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just looking at the notes a little bit. I don't know when maybe Kayla, if you get messages that you should keep me like are written and I should look at right away, let me know. Okay. Beseder. Okay. A couple things here. The Mishnah starts to deal a little bit with the Kohen HaMashiach, right, which is the second category in the Torah. Right, you've got, actually, these are the first category. I think I talked a little bit about this last time, but we'll just look at it now more in particular, how they treat the Kohen HaMashiach, the high priest. Horeh Kohen Mashiach la'atzmo. So the Kohen HaMashiach, the Kohen HaGadol, issues rulings. He is like a court, but he only does it for himself. It's a tremendous diminishment of the Kohen HaGadol. It's a creation. The rabbis in these chapters have created, right, or at least maybe looked back historically, and the authority lies with the court and not with the priest, not with the high priest, right? Whether that's reflective of the Second Temple, right? I have my doubts about being reflective of the Second Temple, but it's part of that larger agenda of the rabbis demoting priestly authority and bolstering the authority of the sages, right? The Kohen Mashiach rules, but nobody else gets to be exculpated by his ruling, only him. So then you get the regular rules. If he rules mistakenly, and he does mistakenly, fine. Mivi par, he brings a bull, right? Because he's not an individual, right? He's the Kohen Mashiach. Shogeg vasa, mezid vasa, shogeg patur. If any element of intention is in there, he's exempt. And then the Mishnah just says, Shehorat Kohen Mashiach le'atzmo, kehorat beitin letzibur. The instruction of the Kohen for himself is like the instruction of the court for the community. But again, like you can see here very subtly, oh, the Kohen Mashiach, yeah, he's an instructor. But who does he instruct? Himself. He's an authority, but he's an authority only for himself. Who's an authority for the community? That's the Horat Beiti. That's the Beiti. Okay. I think I'm going to skip some of these. A lot of these are general rules. There's some exceptions to in Mishnah Dalet of Perek Bet. There are certain rules that don't apply to Vayikra Daled because they fit better into Vayikra Hey. Right, Vayikra Hey is where you have that what Debbie you talked about before, the Korban Olev Yored. Right, there's a different set of sacrifices, so the rabbis sort of write what's going on in Vayikra Daled. The rulings in Vayikra Daled are not the same things in Vayikra Hey, and therefore the consequences of Vayikra Daled do not apply to the sins listed in Vayikra Hey. One of those sins is entering the temple while impure, or not leaving the temple quick enough when you have become impure. Right? And there's a strong relationship I put here between Mishnah Shavuot and Horayot Perek Bet Mishnah Daled, which talks about specifically how do you get a mitzvah aseh. The Mishnah, our Mishnah says, Ein chayvin al aseh, v'al lo taseh shebemikdash. Right? If I'm reading that Mishnah, I don't really know what this is, right? Obviously, other people, like commentators, will know. But this is a Mishnah that you can't really understand without another Mishnah, which here explains what a mitzvah aseh in the mikdash. The mitzvah lo taseh would just be going into, that's relatively easy to understand. You go into the temple when you're impure. Right? By the way, the Torah says you're not supposed to become impure. The rabbis interpret that as you're not supposed to go into the temple when you're impure, right? Because becoming impure is not something you can help. So we'll just maybe even look at that Mishnah. I thought it was an interesting Mishnah. Nitma ba'azara. Someone becomes impure in the temple courtyard, right? It's probably bodily impurity comes out of the person. V'ne'elma mimenu tuma. V'zachor mikdash. So again, in order to be accidental, something has to be forgotten. So he forgot about this rule of purity, but he remembered that he's in the mikdash. Or, a little harder to imagine, Ne'elam mimenu mikdash. He forgets that he's in the mikdash, v'zachor latuma. He remembers his impurity. Or Ne'elam mimenu zeh v'zeh. Both of them are forgotten from him. But notice that word Ne'elam is the same word we see used in our Mishnah. V'hishtachaveh o sheshaha bichtei hishtachavah. Right? He bowed down, part of the temple worship, or stayed long enough to bow down. Baro ba'aruka chayav b'ktsara patur. So if he goes out the long way, he's liable. And if he goes out a shorter way, he's exempt. Because what are you going to do? If you become impure, you got to get out of there as quickly as possible. Zohi mitzvat aseh shebemikdash she'ein chayavin aleha. That's the positive commandment. Here you get that reference. The positive commandment is to get out of the mikdash as soon as you can. That's a positive commandment. The negative commandment would be don't stay there or don't go in the first place. But they invent a positive commandment, get out. And now you get our Mishnah would be an interpretation. The court would say, go out the long way when you should have gone out the short way. That's how a court makes a mistaken ruling on a positive commandment for the mikdash. We get the same thing with Nida, although here it quotes it. Here it quotes it quickly, and the Mishnah Shavuot is a little bit more graphic, but it's Mishnah, so I'll read it. Ezohi mitzvat aseh shebenida shechayavin aleh. When is there a positive commandment for Nida? Hayam mishamesh, for the man here. Hayam mishamesh im Torah. He's having relations with his wife, who's pure. Ve'amra lo nitmeti upiresh miyad. Right? She says to him, you've become defiled, I've become defiled, I became Nida, and he immediately separates. I don't want to get too graphic here, you got a mixed audience. Mipnei sheyitziato hana'alo kibiato, right? Because he gets pleasure, right? And there is pleasure from the Yitzhak. So again, the rabbis are trying to figure out over here all sorts of things. How do you have a mitzvah aseh and a mitzvah lo ta'aseh? Nida is largely lo ta'aseh, but there's also an element of a mitzvah aseh. All right. I think we can skip the Shmiat Kol. The Nasi. Let's talk a little bit about the Nasi. Okay? Hanasi keyotze behem divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So, actually, we have to read the beginning of the Mishnah. Ein chayavin al shmiat kol v'al bitui svatayim v'al tumat mikdash v'kodashav. So there are sacrifices that fit into Vayikra Hey. Shmiat kol is not testifying, hearing a call to testify and not coming to the court to testify. Bitui svatayim is a shvuah, is an oath, and not keeping an oath. And tumat mikdash is, again, I'll just read you that verse. You can see here the transformation the rabbis made. O nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tameh. Anybody who touches something tameh. O benivrat chaya tmea, or a carcass. O benivrat behema tmea. O benivrat sheretz tameh, all sorts of carcass. V'ne'elam mimenu v'hu tameh v'ashem. And he doesn't realize it. The pshat of the Torah, this is actually very interesting. The pshat of the Torah seems to be that you have to bring a korban just for becoming tameh. And the rabbis don't read it the right way. The rabbis read it as you have to bring a korban for becoming tameh and going into the temple. Right? A normal everyday person who becomes tameh outside of the court hasn't done outside of the courtyard, outside of the temple, hasn't done anything wrong. Right? It's only what's wrong is to bring that tuma into the holy area, namely the Beit HaMikdash. I have a friend who wrote a really interesting book about this called Impurity and Sacrifice in ancient Judaism. His name was Jonathan Kalans. It's a really interesting book where the rabbis don't turn impurity into sin, right? Becoming impure is a, largely speaking, natural bodily function. It happens accidentally. It's not sinful to be impure. Women give birth, women menstruate, men have impurities that come out of their bodies. There's nothing sinful or lack of about those. They just need to be taken care of. You have to go to the mikveh, you have to bring a korban, right? They're regular things that occur in a person's life that are not shameful or sinful anyway. You have to deal with them, right? And sort of like maybe even a medical proto-medical kind of way, whereas other Second Temple groups, particularly the Sadducees, the Dead Sea sect,
The Essenes.
the Essenes to a certain extent, right? The Sadducees, the Dead Sea sect, create moral, right? They intertwine what he calls moral impurity with ritual impurity. Ritual impurity is like everyday, no moral connotations. Moral impurity would be murder, avodah zarah, and sexual crimes, right? Adultery, for instance, would be. And moral impurity, it's really just one of my favorite books. Moral impurity can't be cleansed by going to the mikveh, right? If you murder somebody and you're impure, you defile the land and you can't go to the mikveh or to get rid of that impurity. You need to do something else, sometimes death, sometimes other forms of expiation. It's a great, great book. Happy to share about it. So anyway, these things are in chapter 5. So here, back to our Mishnah. Those are the 3 sins listed in chapter 5 for which you bring a different korban. That's the korban olev yored, right? The sliding scale sacrifice. So when you're in Vayikra Daled, we've said this over and over again, it has to be a chatat, right? And it has to be karet and a chatat. And there's no karet chatat situation in Vayikra 5. So pushing back into Vayikra Daled, the court makes a wrong ruling. They don't bring a sacrifice for those things, okay? There's no sacrifice for those sins. And then the Mishnah sort of just jumps into the Nasi, which is listed in Vayikra Daled as one of the people who sins. And very weird editing here in the Mishnah, if you ask me. V'hanasi ki yotzei behem. The Nasi also doesn't bring a sacrifice for these sins that are in Vayikra 5. Right? Somehow we've jumped over to Vayikra 5. The Nasi, who's listed in Vayikra Daled, who does bring a sacrifice, if it's on the Chatat Karet scale, does not bring in Vayikra Hey, because, and this is the normative interpretation, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, is he can't become pure. The Nasi later on in the Mishnah, I don't know if we're going to get to it, is interpreted to be the king. And the king by definition is rich. So to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, once you cannot bring the poor person sacrifice because you can't become poor, so therefore you're not going to end up bringing the rich person sacrifice either, and you're simply exempt for all of those things, right? There's no sacrifice for him. What does he do to get expiation? I don't know. It's a good question. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, Hanasi chayav bekulan. The Nasi is obligated for all of these things, chutz mishmiat kol, right? Except for the testifying, and this quotes the Mishnah in the 2nd chapter of Sanhedrin. Kings are not supposed to be part. You can see Rabbi Akiva interprets the Nasi to be a king. A king is not supposed to be a part of the regular legal system, and therefore he doesn't bring any. Therefore, he's not bringing a sacrifice for that testifying sin, right? For the other ones, for the Tumat HaMikdash, for the temple impurity, and for the Shvua, there he would be liable, according to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva pushes a little back against Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Okay, I want to go on to Mishnah Vav. Let me just see where I am over here. You know what, let's see where I want to skip to. One word just about the Nasi. There's that, I want to mention the Nasi. No. Yeah, okay, let's go to Mishnah. Let's go to Perek Gimel. We got about 10 minutes left. I don't like to go overtime. I know people, an hour is plenty of time. This Mishnah is really exploring a lot about who the Kohen of the Mashiach is and who is the Nasi. And we're going to see here, I think, an interesting statement about the Kedusha of the Kohen HaGadol versus the lack of inherent Kedusha of the Nasi, which they interpret as the Melech. Right. So the first Kohen Mashiach Shechata ve'achar kach avar mishichuto. So a high priest who sinned and then was demoted from being the high priest. Right? The high priest is not a lifetime job. It's not like the Supreme Court. Right? You can be demoted for whatever reason, retire. Right? You can become an ex-high priest. I guess a little like the Pope, right? I never really knew until relatively recently that you could stop being the Pope without dying. But we learned, was it like maybe 5-10 years ago? It could happen there too. V'chein nasi shechata, right? A king, if you will, a nasi, right? Who sinned and v'achar kach avar migduato, who lost his position as king. He was dethroned. Kohen Mashiach mivipar v'nasi mivisayir. They maintain their sacrifices, okay? This is because the sacrifice follows when they sinned. If they sinned while they were the Kohen Gadol or while they were the king, they bring the sacrifices of the Kohen Gadol or the king. However, here's where it's more interesting. Kohen Mashiach Shavar Mimshichuto, a Kohen Gadol who lost his job, right? He lost his anointed status and then sinned. V'chein Nasi Shavar Migduato, a Nasi who was demoted and then sinned. Kohen Mashiach Mivipar v'Hanosi Kehedyot. The Kohen of Mashiach does not change his sacrifice. His status is maintained, right? He is always has that holiness. It reminds me a little bit, maybe, I mean, it's not a perfect comparison, but if you remember the coronation and the of King Charles, right, and the funeral for Queen Elizabeth. I mean, I was fascinated following all that because I felt like I was plugged back into the Second Temple period and looking at something that's like occurring today that was like 2,000 years old. But there was some kind of like, I believe, and also from watching The Crown, like there's like a certain amount of like, once you're of a position of direct connection to God, you can't lose that holiness. And the Kohen has that direct connection to God. The Nasi, the rabbis are demoting, right? He doesn't, right? His position is political. And when he loses his position, he's gone. He's not the Nasi anymore, which I think is an interesting statement on the difference between the position of priest and the position of political leader. Okay. Let's skip the next little section over here. Ezuhu Nasi Zeh Melech. The Nasi is the Melech. Now this is a confusing topic. I actually, in a book that's hopefully coming out next summer, but I'm putting finishing touches on it before it's being edited. We have a chapter, my co-author and I have a chapter on what is the Nasi. So the Nasi in the Torah, who's the Nasi usually in the Torah? What are the Nasi'im? Anyone remember?
Head of the Shvatim.
Yeah, they're the chiefs, right? There's a whole bunch in the Chanukat Bayit, right? The Chanukat Mishkan, right? There's a lot of parshas that talk about the Nasi.
And the Meraglim.
And the Meraglim, right? There's the chieftain. The translation is usually chieftains, the head of a tribe, right? The Nasi, there is a Nasi in the rabbinic period. The rabbis usually imagine a Nasi as being the head of the Sanhedrin. There is a couple parts in rabbinic literature where they imagine the Nasi as heading the Sanhedrin. And the Nasi in the rabbinic period seems to be, I have a friend who sort of worked on this, published as part of his doctorate. The Nasi is like he calls him like the town mayor. It's not like an official mayor, but like a big macher, the kind of guy who maybe was like the head of a synagogue sometimes, a position of leadership. We're familiar with the term Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the most famous, right? We have a whole chapter on Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. The Nasi there is not, he's not the king. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is not a king, right? And he's not a chieftain, if you will. He's like a big macher, some kind of political leader, but not an elected one, and certainly not an inherited one. Zeh melech shene'amar, but here you get he's a king. Right?
Is he the forerunner of the Reish Galuta?
So that's an interesting subject, right? I think that actually, I mean, look, I have two hats on. I wrote Rabbi Joshua Kulp, but I also have a doctorate. So sometimes my mind works academically, and sometimes my mind works traditionally rabbinically. Usually, when I think of history, I think on the more academic side, and when it comes to, let's say, halacha and belief, it's more on the rabbi side. So when you're asking me a historical question, I would say that the other way around, that the rabbinic understanding in late stories of the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael is patterned more after the Reish Galuta and not the other way around, right? The Reish Galuta is the head of the exile and seems to have been much more literally a very powerful position in Babylonia. The Nasi in Eretz Yisrael we know very little about, right? And it's much more, it's much harder to figure out exactly who it is, but definitely not a king, right? This is the only place in rabbinic literature that interprets him as the king. All right, we got to read the last Mishnah. We got to read that last Mishnah here, right? Because it's a famous one. And all of these hierarchies, right? Let's just remember all of these hierarchies. That chapter of Vayikra Daled is a chapter of hierarchies. It's a chapter where you've got the Kohen HaGadol, the Kohen HaMashiach, and the Nasi as being different, right? The pshat of that chapter of the Torah is that they're just different. The Kohen HaMashiach and the Nasi are different. The rabbis obviously maintain a system like that, but they completely undermine it in this last, probably the most famous Mishnah of the Masechet. I'm not going to read the front part. The top part is also very interesting, but I'll read the last line because, how can we forget this? This is like something I teach even the kids here at camp. Kohen kodem Levi Yisrael lemamzer mamzer lenatin v'natin leger v'ger le'eved mishuchrar. So we have a whole priority in terms of, right, this is usually understood like in terms of the Torah reading, but it's not lav dafka. Whenever we have choices of people for priority, the Kohen comes first, the Levi, then the Yisrael, then the mamzer, and the mamzer goes before the natin, and the natin before a convert, and a convert before a freed slave, right? There is the lineage of a person matters, but it is completely undermined by Torah. Eimatai, when is that true? Bisman shekulan shavin, when their learning, as we're going to see in a second, is absolutely equal. Avalim hayam mamzer tamid chacham v'kohen gadol am haaretz. Mamzer tamid chacham kodem lekohen gadol am haaretz. If the mamzer is a tamid chacham, and the Kohen HaGadol is an Am Haaretz, right? Not a Talmid Chacham, then the Mamzer who's a Talmid Chacham gets priority over the Kohen Gadol. I can't think of like a better expression of rabbinic ideology than that Mishnah, right? It's a Mishnah where we've talked like for a couple chapters already. Highlighted, lineage was highlighted in one Mishnah. The Kohen HaGadol is obviously a lineage position, and yet it's completely undermined in the rabbinic mind by learnedness, right? Learnedness, it's not that lineage plays no role, and I'm sure in real people's lives, as it still does today, right? When my children come home with boyfriends or girlfriends, I don't ask right away, but I do ask, what do their parents do? Tell me about their parents. I care. We all care about lineage, right? I'm very happy to hear, I don't know, mother is a scientist and dad works for a nonprofit, whatever. Some noble positions, right? I care about that. I don't, being a Cohen Levi doesn't matter so much, but like it's nice to know they have some good yichus there, and that they're good people, and they're mensches. But in the end, right, what really matters to the rabbis here is a person's own qualities, right? Their own steepness in Torah, which I'm sure includes not just an abstract sense, but also a moral sense, a sense of, right, somebody who's a Talmid Chacham is also supposed to be a moral human being. So I think it's a great ending to the Masechet. It's also 2:00, and it's been fun learning with you guys. I'm looking forward to Menachot will be a new challenge. So it's a hard Masechet, a lot harder than Horayot, but we'll have a good time. All right. Any last questions before we have to hang up? God willing, I'll be back in Israel for about, well before the next classes all meet, but everybody should continue learning, should have an easy fast if you're fasting today, continuing learning in Zvachim, and we'll meet up again for Menachot. And hopefully at a certain point, we're going to be getting some Gemara learning with Drisha also. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope to be learning with as many of you as are interested in the next chapter and the next kind of book. We're moving on to Zvachim. We are putting with Rabbi Avi Wallfish, also continuing on Sundays, the same time period, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. And you can sign up for that, as well as our Tisha B'Av offerings at drisha.org/classes. Thank you, everyone, for making some time to learn, and be well.